Hello YouTube, welcome back to another alternate history video, and today I got the 1988 presidential election, which of course was held between the Vice President George H.W. Bush and Democratic nominee Michael Dukakis. But in this alternate scenario, I got Donald Trump, who of course was the 45th president, and I got Joe Biden, the current president. Now of course Biden actually did run in 1988. It was his first run, but he wasn't too successful because he did drop out due to plagiarism accusations, and so that dogged his campaign. And Donald Trump, of course, who's been a Republican turned Democrat, turned back Republican over the years and independent, was a Republican during this time because he was actually asked by people in the media and Oprah Winfrey whether he was going to run in 1988 or not, and he said, and he declined to, but he said if the country ever needed him, then he would. And of course he did in 2016 and won. But like I said, in this alternate scenario, I got him as if he did decide to run and get the nomination for the Republican Party. Now, of course, 1988 was a very different time compared to today. He came off 2 terms of Ronald Reagan, who had a booming economy and was really popular, got 2 landslide victories in 1980 and 1984, and George Bush, the vice president, ran off his popularity and was able to cruise to another landslide election. Now, Bush did regress a little bit from Reagan. He did lose a few states that Reagan won, but of course it was still a landslide overall. But Dukakis was able to pick up some states that Mondale or Carter didn't win. And so I could actually see a similar scenario in this situation between Biden and Trump. Now, I could actually see Biden maybe winning a couple of states that Dukakis didn't, because Biden was more of like a moderate, like they call him today, but he actually was really more of a moderate, like in 1988. He was actually a bit more conservative on things, believe it or not. So I could actually see Biden have a little bit more appeal than Dukakis, but honestly, I still think this election would favor Trump because they were run off Reagan's popularity, and of course the mood of the country at the time was to continue Reagan's policies since they were really popular, at least for the time being at the time. But like I said, Trump and Biden, I could definitely see Biden, like I said, do a little bit better. But we'll just see, according to my prediction, how he'll do exactly. Now, I believe the states that voted for Trump in present day and vote for Republicans all the time would still go for him, like the Mountain West of Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, as well as Utah. Mountain West, like I said, more and heavy, and they've gone Republican for many years now, and they voted for Trump in his runs in 2016 and 2020. They're present day heavily conservative states, and they were back then too, so I believe they will go for him. I believe Trump would win Colorado in this case. It was more rural and conservative back then. It wasn't really a Democratic state much, as well as Arizona and New Mexico. Like I said, these states vote Democratic now, and Arizona, of course, flipped this year and went to Biden, but with these being more rural and conservative states back then, I don't think Biden would make them as much competitive, so I believe they would go solidly for Trump. As well as the Dakotas, like I said, all these states he's won in present day, I believe would go for him. Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, as well as George Bush's home state of Texas and Alaska, and I believe Nevada would go for him. Like I said, these states weren't really as contested back then. They were really rural and conservative, and no Democrat could really win them except maybe like Lyndon B. Johnson or Franklin Roosevelt, but other than that, they've been ruby red for a lot of years. However, Michael Dukakis did win Washington and Oregon because they were trending blue this time and are solidly blue today. And of course, Biden and a lot of Democrats have won them since the 90s. So I actually could see Biden picking up these states like Dukakis did. So I will give them to him since they were trending blue around this time and definitely are today. And of course, winning them in present day, I could actually see them. Now, I believe Trump would be favored more by the establishment because he wouldn't be as polarizing in 1988 and probably wouldn't be as brash, but I could still see Biden taking it since, like I said, they did go for Dukakis. But California, however, I could actually see Trump still getting because 1988, I believe, was the last time California went Republican, if I'm not mistaken, because I think Clinton won in 92 or either 96, whichever one. But I believe this was the last year for California to go red until it became a heavily blue state in present day. But with Donald Trump being more of a, I guess it was more of a like a liberal Republican back then. Like he had a lot of liberal views like on social issues and gun control. he would definitely be more favored in the state than he would be today, obviously. I could see him holding on to California, doing good like in the Bay Area and doing decent in the cities. However, I believe Minnesota here have been a Democratic stronghold since 1976, so I believe we'll go for Biden. Now, the caucus won Iowa because there was a farming crisis in the Reagan administration, so it helped the caucus here. And of course, the state voted for Trump in 2016-2020. It's become really red now. However, Iowa typically did vote for Democrats before Trump won them. It was actually more of a Democratic stronghold. Really, it was more of a Republican stronghold for years, but until after Reagan ran in the 90s up until Obama's victories, it was more of a blue state. And I could see Trump making it closer because I believe even though he would have a bit more establishment appeal, I could still see him running a populist message like he did in 2016. And I could see him making the state closer, but because Iowa tended to vote blue back then more and Biden being more of a moderate, I could see him still doing decent like the caucus did. And actually, I think Biden would still win here since it was a pretty solid margin for the caucus, but I could see Trump making it closer because I believe, like I said, he would definitely have a populist message mixed in with establishment at the same time. I think he'd be kind of like the Ron DeSantis in 1988, where he could appeal to the suburbs and rural people at the same time. And moving on to Illinois here, of course, Illinois didn't start going Democratic until Clinton became president. It was more of a Republican stronghold because Republicans did better in the state and did pretty decent in Chicago. And like I said, with Trump being less polarizing, appealing more to the establishment, even to black voters, because of course he was really liked by Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton back in the day. And I believe they actually could campaign for him, crossover. Even if Trump ran as a Republican back then, I could see them actually campaigning for Trump since they were great friends of him back then, before he ran in present day. So I could see Trump hanging on to Illinois for that reason. And I could see him win Missouri like he did in 2016, 2020. Like I said, he would definitely have great rural support if he still runs a populist type of message and could do decent in the cities with some establishment appeal, And for the rest of the South here, I could see him winning, of course, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Of course, it was once the solid Democratic South, but it was really trending red around this time. And of course, Bush being from Texas had a Southern appeal. I could see Trump, even though being from New York, I could see him still winning these states since they were really trending red around this time, and a lot of them are today. I could see him still appealing to these rural voters like he does today and winning these states, as well as Tennessee, Kentucky. He would do great in Appalachia because he could definitely appeal to coal miners like he did in present day. And I believe he won Indiana as well, been a really Republican stronghold for years. And I could see him winning Ohio as well because he would definitely have the great rural and working class appeal like he did in the present day elections. So I believe they will go for him as well. Now, West Virginia could be interesting because it is definitely a solid red state today and was won by Trump both times by solid, big margins. However, it typically tended to vote more for Democrats back then. And I could say with Biden being a bit more moderate and a bit more centrist, I guess you could say back then, I could see Biden actually holding on to it, but I could see Trump definitely making it close because he actually would have great rural appeal and could even appeal to some coal miners. But since West Virginia tended to have a Democratic streak back then, I think Biden would still narrowly hold on to it, but I could definitely see it being in contention. I could see Trump picking it off possibly. But I'll leave that up to you, but just my thoughts personally, I believe Biden could still narrowly hold on to the state because of his Democratic streak back then. Now, up to the Rust Belt here in Wisconsin and Michigan. Now, the caucus won Wisconsin, I believe. Let me check for sure. He did. And Bush won Michigan because Bush and Reagan both did good in Michigan with Reagan Democrats and auto workers. And then the caucus did better in Wisconsin, I guess, with unions and had a good appeal in Milwaukee and the cities and did pretty decent in Kenosha. But since Trump also won Kenosha in present day, I could see him doing pretty well too in the Kenosha part and a lot of the parts of the rest of Wisconsin, especially the rural parts. I could see Wisconsin being close, but I could actually see it flipping to Trump in this case because, of course, when he ran on his populist message in 2016, he was able to pick off these two states. And I could see him doing the same too, especially with his mixed in with his establishment appeal back then. I could actually see Wisconsin flipping to him as well as Michigan, so I will give it to him because of those reasons I mentioned. Now, Pennsylvania, of course, was a Bush state as he did pretty well, like in Philadelphia and stuff. And then the caucus probably did better, I think, like in Erie in the western part. But with it being Biden's home state, I could see him winning it actually in this case, just because they'll run off being Joe from Scranton. And for that reason alone, I could actually see Pennsylvania going to Biden in this case because of the home state factor. Now, New York is another interesting state. It did go for the caucus, and it's been solidly blue ever since. But with Trump being more of a liberal Republican back in the 80s, like I mentioned, I could see him winning his home state of New York, because it actually was pretty close in the election. I think the caucus only won by a few points, if I'm not mistaken, but with Trump appealing more to northern liberals since he was one himself, kind of, but like some Republican ideas, I could actually see him winning his home state. Definitely in a close one, but it could actually be pretty solid, honestly, because like I said, it definitely have home state appeal and being more in favor of liberal things like for abortion and gun control and stuff. I could actually see Trump picking off the state, and it could be kind of bold, but at the same time, I don't think it is as far reaching. I think it is more a realistic thing since it was 1988. I'm actually going to give New York to Trump because of his home state factor and being more liberal back in the 80s. Like I said, it could be a bit of a bold call, but at the same time, I don't think it is, because New York wasn't as big for Democrats back then. It was only by a few points, so I could see Trump winning it because of that home state and being more liberal on some issues back then. And for that reason, too, I could see him winning Vermont and New Hampshire. Of course, they were Rockefeller Republican states back then, and I could see Trump hanging on to him since he was, I guess you could call him a bit more of a Rockefeller Republican back then. I could see him holding on to these states, like I said, as well as Maine, all of its districts. Of course, Maine, the second, was won by Trump in present day, but with all of Maine typically being a more Rockefeller Republican state, I could see Trump winning it like Bush did. Now, I believe Dukakis actually won his home state in Massachusetts. He did. And I think I made the mistake in the last video I made between Bush and Carter. I think I'd said Dukakis actually lost Massachusetts, but I was wrong. He actually won it. However, Bush won Maryland, and I think that's what I was confusing with. I think I had said Bush actually did win Massachusetts in '88 since he was born here and grew up here before he went to Texas. But it was a mistake of mine, which I apologize for. Dukakis actually did win Massachusetts, his home state. And because of Biden being from Delaware, I could see Biden winning it too. I could see Trump making it closer, obviously being from New York at this time and being a bit more liberal, as I've mentioned a few times. But since it was won by Dukakis, I could see Biden winning it still, being from Delaware. And like I said, since Delaware, I believe, would go for him. And like I was saying, Bush actually won Maryland, but I could see Joe Biden actually winning it since he was a bit more moderate than Michael Dukakis, because of course Bush painted him as too liberal, and that kind of cost him because Dukakis wasn't really effective in the debate, so he couldn't really fight back, and that cost him bigly, as Trump would say. But like I was saying, since Bush won Maryland, I could actually see Biden possibly win it, because it tended to be more of a swing state back then, I guess you could say. But it did have more cultural liberalism, which Biden could appeal good, but like I said, Trump could too. But I believe with Biden being from Delaware and neighboring Maryland, I could actually see Maryland flipping to Biden because of that. I could see it, like I said, being close, but with Maryland bordering Delaware, I could see Biden having great support since he was more moderate than Dukakis. And I believe he won D.C., of course, as well as Rhode Island. It wasn't really a contested state and isn't today. However, Connecticut and New Jersey was won by Bush. They were more moderate Rockefeller Republican states like Maine and New Hampshire and Vermont. So I could see Trump hanging on to him in this case. And now Virginia, of course, been a Democratic stronghold now for the past 10 years or more. Of course, it was a Republican state back then, up until 2008, for all the way back from the 60s. So I could see Trump hanging on to it in this case, since the Nova suburbs weren't really that Democratic back then. It seemed like the rural parts tended to be more Democratic back then, and then it really shifted in the state where the rural parts became really ruby red, and the Nova suburbs became really blue. But with Virginia being more of that Republican streak back then, I believe Trump would hang on to this case and actually do pretty decent in the rural parts. But I believe Biden would as well. However, I believe it would go to Trump. And I think he won North Carolina too, since he did both times in his present day run, and as well as South Carolina and even Georgia. Of course, like I said, those were definitely solid Republican states back then. Of course, Georgia is trending blue. It went blue in 2020, but when with this being 1988, of course, I believe it would go Trump, since these states were heavily trending red around the time the Deep South, which used to be once solid Democratic, as I mentioned earlier. And now that just leaves the state of Florida and Hawaii, which I missed. I believe we'll go for Biden, of course. And I believe Florida will go for Trump. Florida actually wasn't contested in this election. I think it shows you it definitely wasn't contested. Of course, like I said, Bush ran off Reagan's popularity with Reaganomics and things like that, and it definitely helped him in a state like Florida. And of course, Florida being Trump's second home state and now home state currently. But with it being a second home state before, I think he would definitely win it since the caucus didn't even get close. It was over a 20-point margin, like I mentioned. So I believe Trump would do the same in the state. And this leaves us our final map with Trump getting 435 electoral votes and Joe Biden's 102. As I predicted, Biden did a little bit better than the caucus. Or actually, it looks like Biden did a little worse in the caucus, but Trump did a little better than Bush when it came to electoral votes. But like I said, it's my final map. If you agree or not, just comment below your thoughts. Give me any different ideas what you think would happen, but I believe this would happen. Trump being elected in 1988 more as a liberal Republican, but still with like a populist message that I believe would help him in the Rust Belt here. But like I said, I thank you for watching. Subscribe and hit the bell for notifications if you haven't, and I'll see you next time.